We're going to start in Hebrews chapter 13. Put your thumb right there. And then we're going to jump over to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12. And I really want to focus on these two particular texts because how you view one verse in Hebrews, as we're going to start, can directly affect your view of God on how you view the other verse. So Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8 reads like this: Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Romans chapter 12, verse 2 now. The Bible reads like this: do not conform to the pattern. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed. Someone say transformed. By the renewing of your mind. Then, after the renewing of your mind, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. Come on, who wants to know what God's will is for their lives in 2020? His good, pleasing, and perfect will. Could it be that the year that we had could have caused us to develop patterns that God does not want us to take into 2020? Oh, I don't think you're hearing me this morning. I said, could it be that the storms, the setbacks, and the trials that we faced developed patterns to be able to take into 2020? This morning, I want to minister a message I've titled New Patterns. Turn to your neighbor and tell him new patterns. Because we're not taking the old 2019 patterns into the new 2020 patterns that we're going to take into. Come on, would you pray with me? Jesus, we need you. We're showing up here expectant of a word from you today. God, would you just use me to minister to those, Lord, that are walking in here fearful because they don't know what 2020 looks like. But I thank you that in you, it's secure, that we can trust to know, God, that we're not going to repeat old patterns, but we're going to have new patterns going into 2020. Would you just speak through me, God? Make this plain text, make it plain, make it simple. And God, we're just so ready for what you have for us in this new year. In Jesus' mighty name, amen. Go ahead, you may be seated. Turn to your neighbor and tell them new patterns on your way down. I just want to welcome our online community one more time for those that are going to be joining us via podcast, YouTube, or wherever you may be watching or listening to this from. We had an amazing Christmas season here at Freedom House Church. The video that you saw is just a glimpse of what we do for our Adopt a Home project. And our Christmas series this year, we themed it called Worship. We themed it called Worship. And the true meaning of Christmas isn't the gifts that you got. It's not the gifts that were underneath the tree. And Pastor so eloquently broke it down that the worship is the true meaning of Christmas. It's not just the worship of things, but it's the worship of a person named Jesus. And that when we worship Jesus, we begin to see the world in a different perspective. You begin to see what he said, your real identity. And so Pastor also said, he put it this way, he said, our Creator, the one who created us, should have more weight in who he says you are than what others say about you. He said, don't let people who didn't create you define you. And I just want to continue this thought on the subject of identity, because I believe if we want to see 2020 differently, then I believe it starts with how we view ourselves through our patterns. And so today what I want to really focus our attention on in the verse we read in Romans chapter 12 is not that, we're going to be transformed and renewed, and those things are great, but if we don't come realizing that we have some patterns that need to be changed, then simply we'll have a repeat year of this year going into the next year and possibly the next. And so what I've come to learn is that patterns actually have the ability to affect your identity. That the patterns that you developed from your childhood, maybe how you were raised and some other issues or the defense mechanisms that you've created can actually affect how you view yourself, and vice versa, is that the patterns that you have affect how you view God. So when we read Hebrews 13, we'll read that and we'll say, I don't know if I want God to be the same, because the pattern that we have of how we view him. Also, how we view God determines how we develop our patterns. If we view God as mean, then our patterns will be, then I need to avoid the mean. If we view God as failing us, then we will create patterns that don't allow us to hurt ourselves. You following what I'm saying this morning? Here's my first point. I'm going to jump right in. You don't have to wait towards the end of the message. The first point, how we view God in our situations or circumstances determines what type of patterns we develop. Your patterns and how they're developed are directly linked to how you view God. What do I mean? Again, in reading Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8, some of you are like, nah, I don't need God to be the same. Because if he's the same, that means next year is, no, man. Not what I want to hear today, Tom. I want to hear how God's going to set me up for success in 2020. What if he is, by bringing to your awareness that there's some things that you cannot afford to take into 2020? You may be sitting here, and you may have been saying, God, I need healing in my body. But because it hasn't happened yet, and I say the word yet, you'll have developed a pattern that, well, God, you're not the same. And I don't know if I will be healed. Some of us, our patterns that we've developed won't allow us to view God as the God who's going to come through, as the God who's going to provide, as the God who's going to have a new year for us come this new year. Instead, maybe, again, you were believing God for healing, it didn't come through, and you're saying, God, I can't believe that I'm going to be healed. Maybe you were believing God for provision, and instead of him providing, your business shut down, and you were forced to move out and back in with the relative. And God, you're not the same. I thought you were going to come through, and here I am, this age, looking like, so how can you tell me that you're forever, God? Maybe you were in a relationship, and it didn't turn out the way that you would have liked, and now you're single, and you're just like, story of my life. Just always going to be single, God, because it's just how you made me. I'll embrace my singleness. But can I tell you that your perspective of God in your season, your perspective of God in your circumstance, your perspective of God directly affects the patterns that you create. And that's what I really want to focus on, is that if we're going to see 2019 and we're going to close it out strong and 2020 is going to be the best year yet, then maybe where we start is reflecting on what patterns did 2019 develop inside of me. Because we all have patterns. Come on, tell your neighbor, we're getting new patterns. So why don't we start here? What's a pattern? Let's talk about this real quick. Let's break down a pattern. A pattern is something that repeats itself in a predictable way. Example, I love coffee. That's predictable. I'm going to have a cup of coffee, unless we're fasting. But I'm going to have a cup of coffee. That's a pattern of mine, is I'm just going to have a coffee. A habit would be that I make the coffee, but I love coffee. Another example is being healthy. Come on, I'm believing in being healthy in 2020. A habit of a pattern of being healthy would be that I work out. So a pattern of me being healthy is directly connected to the habit that I have, because the two are very different, but they work in unison. I could have a pattern of being honest. I could have a pattern of being insecure. I could have a pattern of being self-conscious of how others view me. Now I want to focus on a habit, because what a habit is, it's something repeated regularly that tends to occur without us even thinking about it. Now we can start talking about habits. Again, if my pattern is being healthy, then my habit is that I eat well. My pattern is being healthy, then my habit is that I'm working out. If my pattern is that I'm self-conscious, then my habit is that I'm constantly asking for validation. If my pattern is that I have insecurities, then my habit is that I cheat in relationships. Your patterns matter. Your patterns matter. I can have a pattern of being healthy, but my habit, again, is that I eat well and I work out. I can have a pattern of being punctual. So that means before I leave the house, I'm checking Waze. I'm going to be on time today. I'm going to check the traffic update. I can have a pattern of being mean, but my habit is that I push people away. I can have a pattern of a failed relationship, but my habit is I have trust issues. So I'm going to I'm going to move on. That's what I'm going to do. Patterns. I want to talk about patterns this morning. Because I believe your best year that you're going to see God move in your life doesn't start with more goals being written out. It starts with your patterns. So the verse that we read, I want to shift our focus a little bit because we read in Hebrews 13, but now I want to focus on the text of Romans. The verse that we read, Paul's writing this letter to the Roman church, and he's beginning to identify things. Scholars tell us that he hasn't exactly visited the church. You'll read it out throughout Acts and some part of the New Testament, that Paul, he longs to be there. The reason why he longs is because this was a church that was developed that he hadn't developed. So he wants to go and he wants to just make sure the structure, the health, everything's there. And as he's writing, he's being brought aware of some of the things that have been taking place. In Rome at this time, the Roman culture was heavily despising Jewish Christians. So it was believed that the Roman church was founded by Jews, and at those times, if you know context of the Bible, is that if there was any other culture outside of a Jewish culture, then everyone else was excluded from relationship. But then Jesus showed up. And he said, no, I didn't come just for a sect of people. I came for humanity, and that those who call on my name, who believe that I died, was raised again, shall have eternity secure. And so Paul's writing this, and he's penning this letter, and he begins to go over some topics such as that Christ came for everyone, that having faith in him brings salvations, the problems of the law, because again, Jews were so focused on being around the law, and Pharisees, that was the cruxes that they thought, well, Jesus, you don't fit inside this box, so you're not the Son of God. He also goes on to talk about the faithfulness of God, and it leads us up to Romans chapter 12, where after he begins to explain part of why he's writing this, he recognizes that there are some, patterns that the Roman church is experiencing. They're being heavily influenced by Roman culture. And Roman culture back in those days, they were being brought into a heavy realm of philosophy at that time. And so people were actually being swayed into eloquently thinking. That's why Paul says, he says, I don't come to you in wisdom, and as I come but in the name of Jesus. And he begins to write about how, hey, Roman church, believers, although you're being influenced in a lot of ways, I just need to let you know that's not your pattern. That's not how you're supposed to live your life. And so as he's writing this, what Paul is confronting in the passage in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, is that the thinking and behavior of believers is far opposite than how the world lives on a day-to-day function. In other words, in order for us to get to the rest of verse 12 and talk about being transformed, we have to first look at the patterns that we're not too proud of in 2019. Maybe you're walking in here today and you're just like, man, you don't know what I went through this year. I may not know, but here's what I do know is that sometimes when life hits you, you either develop something to protect yourself or you run into the arms of Jesus. And if we didn't choose the latter over the former, then what we've created is a pattern that we need to talk about. So I want to focus on just the first few words of this verse for most of my time this morning, is because I can't talk to you about transformation if we're not aware that we have patterns in our lives right now at the moment. I can talk to you about Jesus, but the moment that you begin to start thinking, wait a minute, that's not how I'm supposed to operate, is the moment that true transformation begins to take place in your life. So I want to look at this key word that I find in the text, and it's the word conform. Conform. This is a compound word. In the Greek, this word is suskaimatitzo. Go ahead and try and say that. I was up trying to say that word all night last night. It's a compound word, and this is where we get the word conform from, but there's also a descriptor word that's connected to this word. Conforming is to conform to oneself, but it also means to model after something. So the word that's best described alongside to conform is that in order for something to conform, then it's going to conform after the pattern of that very thing. That Paul is writing, I can't afford for you to conform after what's taking place next to you. because that's not the pattern of a believer. So as he's writing this, he's directly saying, he says, Church of Rome, there's a different pattern that you need to be aware of. And what happens when you try and repeat patterns and you're not able to discern what God's will is for your life? You'll end 2019, I don't know, Tom, what I can believe God in 2020. I don't know that I can believe God for 2020 because I'm viewing him through this pattern of fear that I don't know if he's going to come through. It's hard enough when you've grown up in a pattern you didn't choose. Some of us didn't have a choice in our upbringing. But can I tell you today that you're not stuck with that very pattern? Can I tell you today that you have a choice of creating a new pattern? Come on, tell your neighbor, new pattern, new pattern. But Paul's also enlightening us in this first few, this portion of a sentence, and he's saying, hey, the world already has a pattern. And the pattern is sinful, and that's not the pattern that you need to follow, because you following that pattern, you're going to develop habits, and those habits are only going to lead you further from Christ rather than closer to Christ. They'll cause you to develop those bad habits, and he's saying, no, I need you to know that there was someone who came into the world that created a new pattern for humanity, and his name is Jesus. And Jesus, he has the power to transform a pattern so that you're not stuck anymore. That's why I came to bring you good news this 2019, last Sunday of the year, is that if you're here thinking, my life will never change, it's just the story of my life, Jesus can change your patterns. He can change your patterns. Now, I'm not just up here preaching this to you, because this is something that I have to live out as well. And I don't know, maybe you're that type of person, or I love storms and difficulties. I personally don't. But being a believer, I have the awareness that when I face hardship, oh, someone's gonna hear me this morning. When I face hardship, God is with me. That when I go through trials, he's just gonna use it for his purpose. That when I'm in the midst of my hardest days, he's using it for his good. But if our patterns don't view it that way, then we'll view God as being the same, worst, always. So I want to turn our attention now to really drive why I'm talking about patterns this morning, is because we all have them. This year for my wife and I, it was honestly one of the most grueling years I think grueling is a pretty sufficient word for me to use. Because premarital counseling didn't get me ready for what happened to us this year. And sometimes that happens in life, that there's just some things you go through where it just blindsides you. And all you're left wondering is, how am I supposed to respond to this? Earlier in June, so again, my wife and I, we lead our student and young adult ministry. And one of the greatest joys we have is seeing students just being radically transformed. And it's not just transformed because, no, it's that they're falling in love with Jesus. You can give God a clap for that. They're falling in love with Jesus. And during what we call our summer camp, my wife, she had the opportunity of speaking. And while she was speaking, we're hosting a session at our summer camp. And hashtag, if you didn't see, we're moving summer camp to winter camp. Come on, students, I'm giving you time to register. But as she was speaking, her arm started to get numb. And so she was speaking, and she was trying to not make it noticeable. And she gets off stage, and she tells me, babe, like, my arm just kind of went numb. I'm like, I didn't see you hit your arm. Like, where did you hit your arm, babe? Like, she goes, no, it didn't feel good. And so we just monitor it, and days went on. After summer camp, we went on a little quick vacation just to refresh, refuel, and we're walking around, and she grabs me and she says, hold on, babe, I gotta sit down. And I'm like, no, but the store's on the other side. Come on, push through. And it's like, gosh, Tommy. She's like, no, like, babe, my feet are really hurting. Like, I don't know, it just feels like just shooting through my feet. And I'm like, oh, listen, like, you got that look. Like, this doesn't look too good. Like, you okay? Just sit down, we rest, and, days go on, and now we're just like, okay, something's going on. Like, we need to keep close tabs on this. Like, what's happening? And As days goes on, well, one night we're getting home from service, and she didn't look good. And I'm like, are you okay? She's just like, no, I don't feel good. And I'm like, oh, Shondo, what do you mean you don't feel good? Like, is it fever? Is what's going on? Because right now you're flush, you don't look too good. Like, are you okay? And she goes, I just have this shooting pain all over my body. Like, it just feels like numbness, like tingling, and it's just shooting. And I don't know. I need to go to the ER. And so we rush over to the ER and we check in. And of course, the longest line ever. And I'm just like, my wife's heart stopped. I'm just kidding. I didn't say that. Like, see me. But I'm just like, hey, look, like, we got this thing going on. Like, how long is it going to take? My wife's not feeling too good. And so the doctor ends up taking us back, sees us, draws some blood. And he's like, well, Mr. Rodriguez, it's not what we thought it was. And I'm like, what? What'd you think it was? Because right now I'm thinking a million things. Help me just kind of. And he's like, it doesn't look like it's her thyroid. It doesn't look like, she's developing some type of disease there. Maybe it's just autoimmune. I'm like, what the heck is autoimmune? I never heard autoimmune. Like, and he's like, just follow up with your primary doctor, and we'll take it from there. And at this point, we're leaving just like, thanks for not helping, because what do you do when you walk into a place that you trusted, and they don't have answers? And that's how much of this past year felt for us, because we were on this journey, and I never expected to spend as many hours of my time in hospitals and doctors' rooms and waiting for diagnosis just to be told, we can't find the answer. And I'm like, what do you mean? This is why I'm paying you. I just can't find it. We had to run more tests. The doctor tells us, oh, well, your wife's stressed. Yeah, she has high anxiety, and she needs to take a whole month off work. And I'm like, what? How could I allow this? Why didn't I catch this sooner? God, what's happening, God? So we have to schedule up with a follow-up with the specialist, and we go from one specialist to another specialist, and all through this time, our minds are just going, what is going on? Our plans earlier this year were to start a family, and now doctors advising us to push that off because we can't find answers. And we're just at this point where we're just like, what is happening, God? Like, God, this wasn't how I saw the year turning out to be. We end up going my wife has to go get blood drawn, and we end up getting an appointment with a rheumatologist. And rheumatologist is an autoimmune disease doctor, and he tells us, he goes, hey, what did your doctor tell you that you had? And we're out in Malibu one day, and of course, you ever get the worst news at like the worst possible time? We're just out, and we're trying to take our minds off things, and the doctor calls right on time. Jessica Rodriguez, yes, all right, you have an autoimmune disease. We're gonna follow up with you, send you to a specialist, click. And it's like, oh man, I wasn't expecting that phone call. God, we were believing for healing, and it didn't heal us, God. And I'd advise you to not check WebMD alone, because the worst things always come up. Rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, all this thing, and we're just saying the devil is a liar. And I want to be sensitive in this moment, because if you're battling some things, if you got a doctor's report, I came to encourage you, and I came to tell you that our Jesus is still a healer, that our God is still good. Come on, you're not hearing me this morning. I came to tell someone that you cannot afford to let your pattern view God differently. We get to this doctor, and it's now one of the specialists, and he tells us, your doctor should have told you, well, he actually gave you a wrong report. And we're like, oh, no, you didn't. Oh, no, you didn't. It says, yeah, 40% of women actually test positive for autoimmune diseases. Your wife's report came back negative. She doesn't have any. And I'm like, what? Good thing I have new patterns. But I'm just like, what? They say, yeah, follow up with a neurologist. They're going to do some nerve conductions, test out her nervous system. No autoimmune disease. You guys are good. We tried everything. gluten intolerance. We tried this, we tried that. And this is why it's so important that when you're in a storm, when you're going through something, you're around believers that can help encourage you. You're around people, let me try this side. You're around people that can build your faith. All right, I'm gonna try this side over here. That you're around people that can say, I'm gonna pray with you, I'm gonna believe with you, because that's not the final report. Patterns. Because if our patterns were wrong, I don't know how my marriage would be right now. I don't know how my faith would be right now. Go to the neurologist and more blood drawn. I feel like my wife could have filled up a swimming pool with how much blood was drawn this past year. And in the midst of all that, there I am. There we are. God, what? This wasn't supposed to happen, God. You want me to go and minister to students? How am I supposed to minister to students when my faith's hurting, God? You want me to pray for someone? I don't even know if I have the faith to believe that you're going to heal my wife. Oh, God, now you want me to go and evangelize to people, and I don't know if I could. Patterns. Paul's writing this, and he's saying, don't conform, because there's a different pattern for you to believe in. There's a different pattern. And can I tell you, the world will try and get you to follow its pattern. It'll get you with a diagnosis, and you'll begin to believe, well, then I've just given up on my faith. So long, 2019. So long, 2020. Well, my God's not going to heal, so then I'll just go and try this, and I'll go experiment again, and I'll fall back to old patterns. You need to surround yourself in the right community, because the right community will help you see the right patterns. We end up getting the diagnosis, it's a zinc deficiency. And it's like, so all we have to do, not all we have to do, but what we have to do is take more zinc. How did it take this long? My God. Oh, we're on the road to recovery. She's doing well, the medication, everything's going great. And I'm still believing, we're still believing that God's gonna just completely heal her. But it crushed me to see my wife on a hospital bed, and I couldn't do anything. You don't think my old patterns kicked in? I'm just as human as anyone else. I thought about quitting. I thought about throwing in the towel. And I couldn't help but say, God, I'll give up. If that's what it takes, I'll give up to see my wife be healed. I can't do this, God. But I came to encourage someone this morning. You've gone too far this year. You've gone too far this year. I'm going to try this side over here. I said, you've gone too far to give up this year. You need to stay in the fight, because your children are watching the patterns that you're setting. Come on, some parent needs to hear this. You are not going to lose this year. Come on, some business person needs to hear this. That the pattern that your business partner had, God had to let it fail, because that's not the pattern that he had for you. If you're here and you have a diagnosis, my Jesus heals. He heals. Come on, cancer's going to be lifted off of you. Come on, ailments are going to be gone. Come on, provision's going to be met through him this year. But it's our patterns. It's our patterns, because had I lapsed and went into my old pattern, I probably wouldn't here before you. And I'd often ask God, why? Why, God? Why? Why right now? Come on, every failed pregnancy test, every announcement on Instagram about another person. God, why? God, why? Why, God, why? And then I come to a student night, and I see students being transformed. And then I come to church, and I see salvations. Oh, you're not hearing me. I said, and then I see a family member get saved. And then I see God using the pain to share a story. Can I just help someone this morning that feels like quitting to end their 2019? God is going to use your story to get the glory. I said he's going to use your story to inspire other people. He's going to use the thing that the devil tried to take you out this year. Because guess what? He's been trying to get you to go to old patterns, but God set a new pattern. He's saying, I'm going to take you from here to glory, and I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that. Come on, tell your neighbor, it's in your patterns. It's in your patterns. It was so hard. We wanted to quit. And as I was filling this out, and like, God, what? He said, make your second point a declaration. Here's your second point. You need to declare this, that in 2020, in 2020, that you're going to develop new patterns. Come on, you're not going to let the old patterns get the best of you anymore. Come on, there's grace. There's a God that we serve of second chances, and we're going to develop new patterns going into 2020. How do we close out 2019? We're going to develop new patterns. You're not going to go back to your old patterns. Look, I understand that maybe some of you in this room, you can't relate to that story because you feel that it wasn't a sickness that tried to get you to resort to old patterns. It was just your already existing patterns. And you're like, Tom, I'm too far. God can't use my life. If you only knew about 2 stories out of the hundreds of stories that I could tell you, then you would know that God would never want to love someone like me. I mentioned earlier that Paul wrote Romans, but I left out one important detail about Paul, and that was that Paul had a change of name. I said that Paul had a change of name. And if you're new to this thing that is called faith in Christianity, then you would get real happy about this point right here. Because Paul was once named Saul, but he had one God moment. One moment where God showed up in his life and changed everything around you. That's why you can't get stuck on one slip up. That's why you can't afford to go back to your old ways, because you're gonna have a but God moment where God shows up in your life. So let me tell you a little bit about this man named Saul. Saul was a persecutor of Christians. Saul was a murderer. Saul did everything he possibly can to not let the good news spread. Saul, one moment, transformed into Paul. He's not writing to us from theory. He's not writing this letter and saying, Church of Rome, believers today, you should not conform to the patterns of this world. Oh, that's a great point, Holy Spirit. No, he's saying, no. I once conformed. I once did it. Let me read you this verse. Acts chapter 26, verse 5. You're going to catch the word. They have known me for a long time. This is Paul right now. He's on trial because he's trying to do everything now after this transformation of his life to spread the gospel. And he's saying, and they can testify, they being religious sects, if they are willing, that I conformed to the strictest sect of our religion, living as a Pharisee. Paul was saying, look, believer, I was there, and that's not the pattern for you. So today, listen to me. Whatever you walked in here with, whether it was a mess-up, whether it was a form, a deficiency, that's not the pattern that you're to follow. You've come too far already in 2019. It's time to start 2020 with new patterns. This is what I'm trying to drive, is that in order for us to see the transformation, it comes by first realizing the enemy tried to take me out and develop patterns that weren't, but not after today. Because we're going to finish 2019 realizing, God, I got some patterns that I need you to work on. It takes one but God moment in your life and everything changes. I said it takes one but God moment in your life and everything changes. That's why God said make point number 2 a declaration, because he said, I'm getting ready to equip people before they think it's too late, before they say, oh, we'll only have a few more days before 19. No, I'm getting ready to make new patterns in people's lives, that their old self's not going to be their new self in 2020. That what they did, they're not going to take those things with them in 2020. It ends today. Touch your neighbor and tell them it ends today. You're going to have patterns that you're not ashamed of anymore. You're going to have patterns that people actually want to model after you now. They're not going to just look at you anymore and be like, they're going to say, there he is. There she is. And you get to walk in there, but God. Can I tell you about my Jesus? Can I tell you how he saved someone like me? Can I tell you that I was once addicted? Can I tell you that I was once like this? Can I tell you that I was so full of shame, that I was so full of guilt? But God showed up in my life, changed my patterns, gave me a new pattern. I'm not the addiction. I'm not the diagnosis. I'm not what people say about me. I am his. and he is mine. We have a pattern. We have a pattern. Now I think we're ready for the rest of the verse. Because if we're unaware that we have these patterns, then we won't know how to be transformed. And here's what Paul writes in the rest of verse 2. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind. I said, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that's what we're doing this morning. We're renewing our minds. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Is there anybody that just wants to know what God wants for their life in 2020? We're doing it this morning. We're doing it this morning. To come to a close, I want to quickly look at another word that I see in this text. It's very important. It's this word renew. Don't get me wrong, transformation is vital. But how many of you've tried a diet and didn't work out because you didn't know all the details? This word renew in the Greek, this is going to help us transform some of our patterns. This word, sometimes it just takes our minds a little longer to catch up. It's like, I know I'm saved, but what it's producing through me doesn't act saved. This word is the word called anakinosis. The literal definition of this word is what we read in certain translations. It says renewed, but this word in the Greek, best translated is this word renovated, to renovate. So what Paul is saying is he's saying, believer, do not conform. I don't think I got to talk about patterns anymore, or conform into patterns. He's saying, do not conform, but instead be transformed by the renovating of your mind. Now, if you've ever done renovations, you would know sometimes things can go wrong, like a house renovation. I didn't know we had all that mold underneath the sink. I guess we have to rip everything out. I didn't know that we got to take down that whole side of the room now because of one little piece of mold. One little, thank you, termites. Got to get all those out. When you begin to renew your mind, you're going to begin to see the old patterns. When you begin to renew your mind, you're going to begin to see, wait a minute, this is still a struggle for me. I said, when you begin to renew your mind, God is going to start bringing things up and bringing things out. And you're going to be able to say, hold up, this is something that I need to develop a new pattern with. Wait a minute. I can't go into 2020 with this same thing anymore because what God has for me in 2020 cannot come with me. Paul's saying, renovate your mind. Renovate your mind. When you begin to renovate is when true transformation takes place. You begin to say, oh man, I can't do this anymore. It develops a new pattern where you can see God the right way. Because it wasn't that God left you. It wasn't that he abandoned you. It's not even that God doesn't love you. It's just that you're not renovating your mind. So your pattern tells you by default. Habit of someone could be cheating, but the pattern is something deeper. You could have developed a pattern in 2019 that takes you somewhere that God hasn't intended for you in 2020. That's why we're talking about patterns. I could have easily said, God, I'm going back to my old patterns because seeing my wife on a hospital bed, laying on our floor, crying and just holding her. God, this isn't the pattern that I thought. I came right now to encourage someone that what the enemy tried to use in 2019 to get you to conform to the world's patterns, God is going to use that very thing to be the greatest story in 2020. I need to know that I'm talking to someone today that's had a little bit of a rough year, that's gone through the fire, that's maybe been in a few seasons, that in 2020 you're saying, oh devil, you may have gotten me this one time, but I love the fact that I can just get God in his presence and I can say, God, renew my mind. Show me the patterns that I need to destroy. Show me what I need to make new. And he does every single time. Would you stand to your feet with me as I come to a close? Before 2019 ends, we're going to allow God to renew our minds. Because we're going to develop patterns in 2020 so that we can have some of the best years yet. And for some of you who are here where you're like, hey bro, there's 3 points on here. Why is it empty? That's for you to fill out for what God spoke to you today. Because sometimes if you don't write out what you need God to work on in your life, your pattern by default, you won't do it. So I was thinking, God, how can we end this? And I just felt him saying, I need time with him. So here's what we're going to do, because a word like this requires a response. I want you to just respond to God this morning. We're going to worship, and I believe God is going to show you the pattern that you cannot take into 2019. I also believe on the other side of things, because I don't want to make it sound like, whoa, I'm all messed up, that God's going to show you the new pattern for your best year yet in 2020. So as we transition now, we're not taking any more toxic patterns into 2020. We're done. We're done with those. Come on, we're not taking anything that the enemy tried to use. He may have used depression. He may have tried to get you a new pattern for suicide. He may have given you a pattern that you would think so low of yourself that you don't have purpose, so you leave.